Aloha! Welcome to the Live Ukulele Podcast. My name is Brad Bordessa. Thank you for tuning in today. Today we're going to talk about music theory. Some of the things that you should probably learn, some of the things that you probably shouldn't learn or don't need to learn. Should be an interesting discussion, just kind of revolving around, I did my street theory workshop a handful of months ago, and I tried to include as much relevant theory information that's practically useful for an ukulele player in that content. But how I came to the conclusion of what things to include or not, I thought I would kind of talk about some of my reasoning because I don't get into that in the workshop. If you want to find out more about the Street Theory Workshop, just go to liveukulele.com and click on Store in the menu, and you'll find Street Theory right there at the top. Just look for the graffiti letters, and you can check it out. It's 80 minutes of ukulele theory, ukulele-focused theory, and it covers most of the main things that I talk about in this podcast. I recorded the body of the lesson part of this podcast, or the middle part of the podcast, a couple of months ago when it was fresh on my mind. I'm just now putting it together as we get the year rolling here at the Live Ukulele Podcast. Want to remind you folks that if you like what you hear, please subscribe, review, shout it out as best you can about this podcast, share it with your friends, tell people about it. Word of mouth is really the best way to get it out of there. And if you want to check out some of my lessons, like I said, go to liveukulele.com and click on Store. That is the best way to support my work directly. And plus you get some awesome resources, some lessons, video lessons, ebooks, different kinds of things. There's a lot there. It's growing all the time as I put out new products. So please go check that out and subscribe wherever you're listening to this at. So with that said, let's get right into the topic today. I'm going to hand it off to my past self. Let's go. All right, so let's talk about music theory. I've brushed on this in the past. Previous episodes, we've talked about theory a little bit, but in this episode, I want to kind of dedicate the whole episode to talking about music theory, not necessarily how it works and a music theory lesson, because I did a while back come out with my Street Theory Workshop, which is kind of a crash course on theory basics. I put it together because I felt like a lot of folks felt like they needed to learn music theory, and everything that's in that workshop is stuff that I think is vital to ukulele players, but none of the stuff that is kind of overkill, which I wanted people to be able to avoid. So just going to talk about kind of the philosophy of understanding music from that perspective. And this is going to tie in, I'm not sure exactly where this is all going to go, but it might tie in with like Hawaiian style learning and Western style learning, things like that. But let's get started and we'll see where we end up. So I can make a couple of statements that hopefully most people will not disagree with, that we can accept as kind of universal truths. 1, music theory is useful. It explains things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to really understand in music, like how it works, why things happen and lay out the way they do. Music theory can explain that. Number 2, most people don't need to learn as much music theory as maybe they think they do. They don't need that in order to play better music. There's like a cap where the average person is going to be diminishing returns past that point. And number 3 is you don't actually need music theory to play amazing music. Lots of people have played amazing music without knowing any theory whatsoever, can hardly even name the chords or the notes that they play, and yet create amazing, beautiful music. So that's kind of, my statements are a spectrum, right? There is learn all the theory all the way to don't learn any theory at all. And I'm of the belief that a happy medium is the best thing that you can do for yourself. So just to give a little backstory and hopefully make this more relevant and tie it all together, when I was a young man and I was learning to play ukulele and learning different things, I fell into the trap that a lot of Western thinkers do, in that, wow, music theory, it explains things. It must be able to explain everything, and music theory can teach me how to play better music. That was what I thought, 14, 15-year-old me. And long story short, I learned that that is not the case. But along the way, I learned all the theory that I could, basically, short of like really advanced jazz theory stuff that I would have had to really dig for and would have had trouble finding material to learn from. But I really dug to the bottom of all the conventional stuff. I learned how to read music. I learned all the ins and outs, all the tips and tricks, all the formulas and things like that for how music is put together. And the spoiler alert is that I was never a better ukulele player for it, physically on the instrument, like in my ability to express music. Didn't help. Not helpful. What it did do is it gave me a good understanding of how music works and why when I play something on the instrument, why it happens that way, or how to figure out how to put something onto the instrument. But the actual playing of the thing, not helpful. Music theory didn't make me a better player. And I would dare say that it won't make pretty much anybody a better player. It can help you understand. It can help you figure out things, help you feel more comfortable in what you're doing and communicating with other musicians, but it will not make you in and of itself a better ukulele player. So how do you find this happy medium? Well, I think that as with anything you're learning in music, it's really super important to be able to immediately use whatever you're learning and apply it to the music, right? Immediately practical. That's what I like to say about things. It's immediately practical, whatever you're learning. And so if you approach music theory from that standpoint, and you're learning music theory, and you learn the chromatic scale, how you go from A to A sharp to B and then to C, right? That C is always a surprise. You got to remember, this is my one sort of talking point about the chromatic scale, is you remember Bunny, Catcher, Elmer, Fudd, and you can remember that there is no enharmonic sharp or flat between B and C and E and F. And if you learn that, and then like in the next 5 minutes, you're learning how to play a song, and you realize that, okay, so I'm playing this song and I play this G note here, but I want to play the G note in a different place. This fingering location doesn't make any sense, and I want to move it. Well, if you know the chromatic scale, you can figure out another G note location without needing to have memorized the fretboard or to know the fretboard. So in that sense, learning the chromatic scale was immediately practical. You just had an application for it right away. And, of course, the chromatic scale is a very, I think, I'm always surprised at how late the chromatic scale comes in for a lot of folks who are teaching or learning music theory. It's like, that's what I start with. That's what it all is based off of. Because it's basically the string. The entire string, if you play every single fret up to the 12th fret, that's a chromatic scale. So it's like, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And from there, you might move on to, how to play a major scale. Well, how do you take that chromatic scale and apply whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half to the chromatic scale and pull a major scale out of that. And if you're going along and you're in the next 5 minutes playing along in a song, and then there's like a gap and you realize, oh, well, maybe I should try and play a little improvisation here. How would I do that? And you know that the song is in the key of G, and you know that if you can figure out a G major scale, you'll have kind of a baseline for what notes are your main options for sounding good in that key. You could figure out a G major scale from the chromatic scale. Boom, immediately practical. This will happen up to a point, and you'll be able to take these things that you learn and they click, and you can use them right off the bat. You can see where they go. It will help you as you are studying. And maybe that point for you is you start learning like the circle of fifths. I kind of have a pet peeve with the circle of fifths because for my brain and my head, I don't get it. I don't see how it makes anything any easier. And to me, it's just an extra step to get where I'm going. So I don't teach the circle of fifths. I don't recommend anybody use the circle of fifths, but I do understand that it can be helpful for some people who have brains that are not wired like mine, right? We're all different. We're all going to learn different things. And we're all going to find different things useful. But for me, I don't get the circle of fifths. So if I look at the circle of fifths and I start looking at it and trying to solve it and figure out what the heck it does, that's not immediately practical for me to use, especially if there's another way that I can figure the same thing out easier and faster, which I feel like I can if I just, if I've worked my way up through the sequence of music theory that most people will follow, I'll have a baseline for figuring that stuff out without needing the circle of fifths and without needing to add that, shall we say, bloat to my music theory study. And at that point, you can just cross that off your list. Like, okay, well, I'm not finding that useful at this moment, so I'm going to set it aside, put it on a list, maybe come back to it in a year or two. Maybe it will make more sense then. Maybe it will be more useful at that point. But if not, don't pressure yourself into feeling like you have to return to something. If it's not helping you understand or figure things out easier, there's not really any point learning it unless you just want to stretch your brain, which I do realize that folks like to do. They spend 5 hours a day practicing, retired guy just getting a big kick out of playing the ukulele. That's awesome. There's only so much ukulele you can play. And then, maybe at bedtime, poking through some theory lessons is a different way to kind of scratch the musical itch and feel like you're doing something related to music. I get that. I can relate to that. I remember doing that. I was like, wow, I've played so much today, and now it's time to open a book and just think about music. But if your time is really valuable and you have somebody breathing down your neck, whispering in your ear, like, you have to learn music theory, or you have a music teacher where that's like all you're learning, I don't necessarily believe that that is the most effective use of limited time resources for somebody who wants to just play music. So with that said, I sent out a newsletter a number of months ago about it was supposed to be a reminder for the street theory workshop, just to let people know, like, hey, this thing is still out and here are some other, factoids regarding it. And it ended up being this big list of different music theory things that I kind of ranked in their order of importance and how much use or value you might get out of one thing as opposed to another, just to kind of lightly guide folks who maybe don't have access to a teacher who could tell them these things, or access to a unbiased teacher as far as these things go. So I want to read it here and maybe elaborate. I think that needs to be a new word. Elaborate on some of those things and why I put them where they are. Do you struggle with knowing how to get to your next note on the ukulele? How to move fluidly across the fretboard? Left Hand Technique for Ukulele is a video guide to becoming more comfortable with the ukulele. Whether you're a beginner or an advanced player, you'll learn through these 9 hours of HD video lessons how to move across the fretboard, how to play up and down a single string with efficient shifts, how to play from string to string without needing to know theory or interval distances, how to express yourself best using articulations and different ways of dressing up the notes so that they present in a more evocative kind of way. Left-hand technique is all those things and much more. To learn more, visit liveukulele.com/store. All right, so on my list, I have immediately useful and worth learning. These are the things that I feel like anytime I teach somebody how this stuff works, they immediately get a light bulb going on. They immediately kind of see how it all relates to everything else. And hopefully they're able to immediately start using it as they think about music and as they navigate the ukulele, especially the fretboard and how different musical things are related. And so in the immediately useful category, we have pitch, which is just like how basic hertz work. You know, if you have a tuning fork and you bang it on your knee, you listen to it, it's usually an A equals 440. It's your pitch reference. And along with that is kind of like how octaves work. If you have an octave, an A 440 A, that's a very specific A because it has a pitch attached to it. 440 hertz, that's how many times the wave cycles per second. If you change the hertz number, you get a different pitch. But if you double the hertz number or halve it, you get the octave up or the octave down A. And so kind of knowing how that's related just from a note vibrating in the physical space that you're in kind of way, that can be kind of helpful and help turn on some light bulbs. And that goes along with octave and how the scale is divided into 12 pieces. 12 even pieces that musically, inside of a key, if you play through those 12 notes, they're not related to each other as your ear would like to hear them. It's all a little bit out of tune. And a lot of people don't know this. But with the even Western music tuning, it's a compromise all across the spectrum so that all the keys sound good. If we were only never going to play in C, you would sweeten the tuning and sweeten where the notes are. And you can see this on there are guitars that you can get with adjustable frets where you can adjust the frets to sound the most in tune for that key. Because used to be in the old days, it was just like chamber music, right? And all the violin, viola, cello, upright bass, those were all fretless instruments. And so the musicians could adjust by ear to adapt to the key. But as soon as you add frets into the picture, then things get kind of stuck and stiff, and you need to really lean on that even 12-note division of everything to get the pleasing sounds on average across all the keys and all the locations on the fretboard. Anyways, next on the list is the chromatic scale, which is basically the strings on your ukulele. This helps you know how to get around and find notes on the fretboard. Even if you haven't memorized where they're at, you can figure out where any note is or what the name of any note is on the fretboard if you know the chromatic scale. And then steps, half steps, whole steps, how far from each other different things are. This is useful because it helps you start thinking about scales and how far you're moving in like a melody or whatever. Oh, I'm moving up a half step or down a whole step. Those kind of simple step movements are simple to understand, but also useful. If you haven't thought about it, you might miss that little piece of information. And then natural notes and enharmonic notes. This is basically just the sharp and the flat notes. And like I said before, the chromatic scale is made up of letter, enharmonic, letter, right? So you have your natural notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then in between all of those, you have a corresponding enharmonic note. So between A and B, you have A sharp or B flat. It's the same note pitch. You just call it either A sharp or you call it B flat. Except there are no enharmonics between B and C and E and F. Bunny, catcher, Elmer, Fudd. If you can remember that, you can figure out the chromatic scale. And then I have major scales, which is basically figuring out how to build from a chromatic scale using whole steps and half steps. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. You can build a major scale from any note. And you don't have to know your scales. You could just figure it out. From there, I have scale degrees, which is if you assign a number to every note in the scale. So in the key of C, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C notes. If you attach a number to each of those, then C becomes 1, D becomes 2, E becomes 3, F becomes 4, G becomes 5, that kind of a thing. And what that does is it allows you to talk about the relationships inside of a key and the relationships between notes and chords without needing to attach it to a key. So if I say play the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord, I can be talking about any key. And this is useful if we're talking about the relationship of those chords as opposed to what explicitly the chords are with a note name attached to them. If I say play C, F, and G, that's great in the key of C, but if you ever have to transpose it, you have to go back and kind of reverse engineer it yourself to figure out what the numbers are, then move it again. That's a transposing thing, which is also on my list. Same kind of thing. We have the relative minor, which is the 6th scale tone. See how it's kind of all leads into each other, everything that I've got on here? This is part of my master plan. But the relative minor is simply the major scale played starting from the 6th note. So if you count up, C, D, E, F, G, A is the 6th note for C major. A minor is the relative minor. And if you play all the notes in a C scale starting on A and going A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, you get an A minor scale from the major scale. And then finally, there's time signatures and counting, which is kind of at the bottom of the immediately useful list because so much of timing where, yes, people usually struggle with timing, they generally have an idea of how it should go. And usually, you're playing in 4/4 time for the most part, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4/4 time. And the counting is something that most people can think about and figure out. They just get distracted with other facets of music and the timing kind of suffers. But basically timing is just counting, understanding how in 4/4 you get 4 quarter notes and 8 eighth notes and 16 16th notes, that kind of a thing. And then just understanding how to play them and how to read them. I mean, I don't like to emphasize reading music, but rhythms are one thing that's really nice to have that standard notation visual for. And even if you don't learn to read where the notes are at, learning to read rhythms is often helpful. At least for me, it helps me organize the rhythms in my head. And so, because I don't know how else you would really notate the rhythms other than literally writing out 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then marking which one you want the rhythm to be on. That can be a little clunky. If you can learn the rhythmic notations, it can be a little bit more elegant. Okay, after that on the grand list, I have less vital, but still useful for some. These are things that I don't feel like are going to lead to the huge practical light bulb moments as some of the other things, but they do still help explain things, and you can use them in your day-to-day, but a lot of times you end up knowing them already. They already come pre-packaged in things like you look at a chord diagram chart and it tells you how to play chords. You don't need to figure chords out from scratch. Whereas some of the other things, figuring them out from scratch is a little bit, I think, more beneficial than some of these things. But there's only 3. It is how to build chords, of course. Learning how to build chords is really interesting, and it is a great exercise for kind of pulling together your knowledge of the fretboard, especially as you try and find the notes on the fretboard and rearrange and kind of see how everything works together. That's really important. But from a theory standpoint of like, oh, it's the 1, the 3, and the 5 notes that make up a C chord, that's kind of like a, oh, wow, that's how that works. But then practically, it doesn't have a whole lot of usage beyond like playing a song and knowing that when I play the 1 note, I'm playing C. That's the same as the root note in the C chord. Kind of those same scale degree relationships, which can kind of be thought of as covered under scale degrees. And then diatonic triads, which is basically from any key starting on the home chord in the key of C, you'd have C, and then just from every note that you have fretted on the fretboard, you would move up to the next note inside the C scale, and whatever that next note is on each string, it's going to be a D minor chord, right? And when I say triads, I'm usually referring to limiting yourself to only 3 notes. So you only have the 3 core triad notes. So for instance, you could think about playing only on the top 3 open strings. So the G, C, and E strings, those together are a C chord. If you move up one at a time on each of those strings to the next note that occurs inside the C scale, for instance, on the G string, you'd move up to A, so that would be on the 2nd fret. And then on the C string, you'd move up to D, that would be also on the 2nd fret. And on the E string, you'd move up to F, that would be on the 1st fret. So 2, 2, 1 would be D minor. That would be the next chord that occurs in the scale. And this is one of those things that you can just kind of learn just by rote. You memorize that the diatonic pattern is major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished 7th, then back to major, right? So you have C, and then D minor, and then E minor, and then F, G, A minor, and then B diminished 7 thing, and then back to C. Also on the list is intervals. Intervals are how far apart different notes are, and if you've already looked at like half steps and whole steps, you'll have a good sense for this. And intervals beyond that are just like larger distances and how to name larger distances across the fretboard. More important than knowing what they are is knowing how they sound. And if you just kind of play a lot and pay attention to what you're playing and maybe even sing what you're playing, you'll start to get a sense of kind of knowing ahead of time what the intervals are going to be, what they're going to sound like. And this kind of gets into the solfege thing, which is way further down my list just because it's kind of an involved separate course of study. But like being able to know what a certain note is going to sound like and figure out how to imagine that note in your head so that when you actually play the note, it matches. Just that kind of innate understanding of the instrument. This is not something you need to know technically. It's something you will learn just from playing. You don't have to know any theory to know what the next note you're going to play is going to sound like, right? That's just an intuitive thing. But you can name that with the theory if you want. Okay, the next one's kind of quick. It's just things that you'll learn passively, kind of as you move along through doing different things. You'll just absorb it. We have minor scales because of the relative minor. All the major scales you learn are also minor scales. And for the most part, it's easier just to play the same scale and hear it in a different way, hear it from the minor note, than to learn a completely new scale. Just think of them as one and the same and just know what either or is called, and you'll absorb that over time. That's why you probably don't need to separately study minor scales. And like Like in the Street Theory workshop, I talk about how to build major scales from a chromatic scale using a whole step and half step pattern. But I don't talk about creating a minor scale because it's kind of redundant, because all you're doing is just using the relative minor to figure out the minor. And the pattern actually that you would use, that I don't specifically teach, it's the same pattern, you're just starting it from a different place, right? Because it's the same distance between all those notes. Key signatures is another one. This comes hand in hand with the major scales. As you learn the major scales, the notes of the major scale are the notes that make up the key signature. So if I'm playing in the key of C, I have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. No sharps or flats, right? But if I move to the key of G, I end up with G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. So in the key of G, there's one sharp. Because it occurs naturally in the scale that you play, that becomes the key. So major scales are not in and of themselves keys, but they're very, very closely related. And in a lot of senses, you can think of them as the same thing. Chord inversions are just a rearranging of the notes on the fretboard where kind of you output the sound of the chord that you're figuring out. And so this you'll absorb by looking at chord charts, things like that. A lot of the theory behind chord inversions isn't super important. You just know that you're going to, on each string, skip up to whatever the next note inside the chord is, shuffle it around until you find a playable shape, and you're off to the races. And finally, arpeggios, which are the same notes as a chord. You're just playing them separately, usually in order, or as in the same order as the chord voicing you're intentionally going for. Ukulele chords are a system. To learn them any other way is time-intensive and counterintuitive. Ukulele chord shapes will teach you the method behind finding and locating and creating chord shapes on the ukulele fretboard, including a large library of chord families and chord shapes, along with some of the theory and background you need to understand chords better and to use them on your own out in the wild. To learn more, go to liveukulele.com/store and look for ukulele chord shapes. Okay, and then we have probably the most interesting part of the list, which I put as meh/only if you want. The first of these is reading standard notation. I don't think that reading standard notation needs to be a requirement for anybody playing ukulele. There are enough tabs to go around and keep people busy for the rest of their lives. No standard notation needed. It is useful, especially if you come from a background of like, when I was a kid, I learned to play piano, or I was in the high school band and I played flute. If that's you, then reading standard notation, if you're playing ukulele later on in life, whenever that ends up being for you, reading that standard notation might be easier. It might help you visualize things in a better way. But for average Joe who just, had a midlife crisis and decided they're going to learn to play some music, that is probably not necessary. It doesn't have a lot of relevance to the guy who just wants to strum some chords and sound a little bit like what he hears on the radio. That's, you don't need to read standard notation to do that. You don't even really need to read tab. You just look at a chord sheet for the song. That said, if you do want to learn how to read, you've got that's a whole separate kind of thing, because there's two levels of reading, right? There is, I can figure it out, which is me all day long. I can sit and, kind of look at the lines, and the more I do it, the faster you get, of course. Look at the lines, see what's going on, and then look at the rhythm, and then very slowly kind of parse together what's happening. Like, okay, it's going to sound like that, and then that, and then that, and that. It'd probably, if I play it, it'd be like this. Or there's like real sight reading, which I wish I could do, just can't seem to dedicate the time to it. It's one of those things that you kind of have to use it or lose it. And I never read off of standard notation. Like, I'm never learning anything else from standard notation. If I'm learning by ear. So sight reading would be that next level. And that's a lot of dedication. That's a whole different field of study. I super respect people who can do that. When I was a kid, my family took a trip out to, I want to say Angel Camp, something like that in the Sierra foothills in California. Just going around, I think my mom was writing an article about it or something. My mom's a writer. And we stopped at this little ice cream parlor in some far out boonies, like western gold mine town, and got some ice cream. But there was a guy there playing ragtime piano. And I think I learned later that this guy can sight read like a monster. He's just an amazing sight reader, and he uses that skill to be able to kind of play in a ragtime style any sort of song that people bring to him. If I could possibly find him, I'll try and throw a link in the podcast notes. But I've later saw videos of him, people bringing him like show or video game songs that he had never heard before, but he was able to sight read it, and he interpreted it in a ragtime style, like just super honky-tonk piano kind of thing, versions of Lord of the Rings or Super Mario or whatever the song was that he had never heard before, but he was able to play it because he could read super well and just interpret it on the fly like that. And that's always been something that I would love to be able to do, but just practically, I have no use for it. Okay, and then we move on to circle of fifths, which I talked about a little bit already. I don't see the value of circle of fifths. Doesn't mean there isn't a value, but just in my head, it does not compute. And since I have to teach these things, I don't teach it to people, because if it doesn't make sense for me, I'm not going to be able to explain it to somebody in a way that makes sense for them. I don't feel. So I don't do anything with circle of fifths. If you really think it's going to crack some code for you, have a go at it. But otherwise, I don't think this is a very essential skill for most ukulele players, because just knowing your scale degrees and having an idea of your 1, 4, 5 in each key, that's going to tell you all the same information without needing to look at a chart and go around and figure out where you stop. Next one on here is chord extensions. This one's kind of here or there. This goes along with building chords, but it would just be like understanding once you get outside of like triads, playing just a basic major chord or a basic minor chord, you start adding sixths and sevenths and ninths and 11ths and 13ths. And this stuff is interesting, and it can give you some nice, pretty chord voicings, but it's all kind of stuff that you could find easier and faster in a chord book. Like if you were to look up in my chord book, ukulele chord shapes, that's all kind of already in there. It's already figured out for you. And it would just be like an intellectual exercise to actually figure out how it all goes together. Because on the ukulele, you only have 4 strings. So you can only never play 4 voices at a time, which means a lot of the jazz chords that we play are kind of false. They're not the actual chord, because you're leaving pieces out. And a lot of times there's kind of the assumption that your ear is going to do its magic trick of hearing the imaginary bass. Or if you're in a group, you actually have somebody playing that bass note, and there's more room to move around. You don't have to worry about holding down the harmony. But in all my travels and in everything that I do, I've found that just standard 4-voice chords, a lot of times on ukulele, give a more pleasing sound because they're not so abstract and they don't lean on so many aural assumptions, shall we say? Because if you're playing a 13th chord, you're leaving out half the notes. You're not even playing half the notes. So that's a lot of information that your brain has to fill in. And depending on the audience, their imagination might not fill that information in, and it just kind of sounds ambiguous almost. So a lot of times I like to play more straight ahead voicings. And that's just me. If you're like a jazz buff, you're going to hear those things better and kind of intellectually understand how that chord should sound or how you've heard it before in a band. And when you play it, your mind's ear is going to fill in all of the notes that aren't there. But for me, I like to try and present my songs in as straightforward a manner as possible, so there can be no kind of confusion or no guessing on the listener's part of what is happening. So I just keep it really simple. But I'm a simple man, and that's how I roll. Music theory is very important. It helps explain music and helps you understand how it works on the ukulele. But for ukulele, music theory is often over-taught, and you get a lot of extra information that you don't need. So I created Street Theory, which is an 80-minute video workshop where I walk you through the most important parts of theory without any of the fluff. In this lesson, you'll learn about the chromatic scale, how to build scales from the chromatic scale, how to identify them in musical situations, how to build chords, how to transpose, and a couple of other things that are immediately useful for ukulele players. You can learn more at liveukulele.com/store. Just look for Street Theory, and I'll see you in the workshop. Okay, home stretch here on my list. Hopefully this has been interesting and not just tedious, but I hope that folks can listen to this and realize that maybe let themselves off the hook for thinking they need to know more theory than they actually do. Because you heard it here first, most ukulele players do not need to know all that much music theory, if any music theory. But if you feel like you need to know some music theory, if you want to be intellectual about it, you don't need to know as much as you might be led to believe. Okay, so with these kinds of things on this part of the list, these are all things that they are still useful because it's all useful. It all has a place. It all explains something. But for most people, they're never going to use it until a very specific point in playing music. And some people may never reach it. Some people may only use it a little bit. And in 99% of these cases, it's one of those things where when you get there and you realize that you need it, that's the right time to learn it. If you try and learn it before then, you're just going to be spinning your wheels because you won't have any kind of real world application like we've talked about. Okay, the first one on here is one that I'm not so sure should have been on here. It's solfege, which is basically being able to sing or hear in your head exactly which note is coming next based on the degrees in the scale, right? So if I'm playing a C note and the next note that I'm going to play is an E, I want to be able to hear in my head that E sound. And so with the solfege, it's like a separate kind of a class. It almost doesn't live with music theory because it is kind of its own skill that you have to work on and practice. And so that's less of a theory thing and maybe more of a separate course of study. It's super valuable, but because it's such kind of a specific thing, I don't think most folks are going to go to that level to actually learn it. That's why I kind of thought I would put it here. Avoid notes. Avoid notes are basically just the notes that you play being very dissonant with the chord that you're playing over. And I don't really know a lot about this because I've never thought to learn music in this very specific way. But you know, there are tones that are going to be more dissonant depending on what chord you're playing over. But this is a very intellectual way of playing music that I really don't relate to. I don't think that most ukulele players take this course. I've never really seen a place where you would study this super heavily, unless you're like really super high level, in which case, you know, this podcast doesn't relate to you because you can kind of take care of yourself. But the avoid notes, it's just overthinking, in my opinion. Is kind of too much. Like for me, I've never really thought about an avoid notes, but as I'm playing and I've learned kind of to see the future of what I'm going to play, I know how to not play the notes that aren't going to sound good or that I don't want to create. And those for me are my avoid notes, but I don't think of them technically as I'm playing. Like, oh, better not play the B here. It's going to sound bad. That is, my brain doesn't compute that fast. Maybe somebody with a higher overclocked brain could make that work. But I don't think about things like that. And I've never met anybody who really does. Some people like to think that they want to play music like that, super intellectually, where like everything has its place. But for the most part, those are not folks who really, I feel, are super successful in music, because there's just no intuition and it's all overthought and technical, and you never actually end up playing a whole lot because you're thinking about things too much and the song is passing you by. Next one is modes. Modes are basically the same as the relative minor. You're just starting from every scale degree. So if you're playing in the key of C and you have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, you can play those same notes but start from the second degree. So you would start on D. So you'd go D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. That would be a mode of the C major scale. And each degree in the scale has a mode name. And there are songs that are kind of modal, like a lot of Santana's music is in the Dorian mode. It kind of has that sort of a sound. But for most people, they're just going to play this and play what sounds right. And you don't need to think about it so much. And a lot of the modes are really, really kind of out in left field, weird sounds musically. And so overthinking about the modes seems a little bit pointless for most people, right? There are certainly going to be some weird jazz freaks out there who are really diving deep into the capabilities of the ukulele and its harmony. But for the most part, that is not something that most people need to know. Chord progression formulas. This is basically just like a flow chart of where chords are going to go. And I know people like to think about chord progressions and learn chord progressions and where's it probably going to go? But for me, this is more ear training than anything. If you're thinking about where the chord is going to go, your ear is going to tell you. And then next time you play that song, you're going to have an idea where it's going to go because your ear told you in the past. So thinking about chord progressions and flow and I'm going to roll a dice is like 33% chance I'm going to go to this chord and a 66% chance that it's going to be this chord. Again, too technical in my opinion. Just, work on your ear training and be able to hear the 1, 4, and 5 chords as you're going through songs. And especially if you're, playing Hawaiian music, working through Hawaiian songs, you're going to get used to these sounds, and that is the organic way to internalize this same sort of thing without needing to overthink it. Diatonic sevenths, inverting intervals, altered chords, altered scales are the remainder of the list. These are just things that the average person is not going to use a whole lot. You can learn about them. There's nothing wrong with learning about them, but the only wrong would be is if you have a limited time budget to put into music and you're spending time learning these advanced theory things that you're never going to actually play or apply, and that is taking time away from actual play time on the instrument. Because here is kind of the bottom line with music theory. You can learn theory, it can help you explain things, it can help you understand what's going on. But most of the time, all that really has to do with playing better music is time on the instrument. Playing more things, figuring more things out, using your ear to play melodies or learning songs or performing. All of those kind of applied music things where you're actually holding the instrument and making music on the instrument, those are going to go further in helping you become a better musician than learning the theory. Because what I find is that the huge majority of my students are Western thinkers, right? They all went to college, they all got their high school degree, They live in a Western world. And because of that, they overthink things a lot. So the theory is very easy for Western thinkers, is what I find, is that people grab onto it because it's like, oh, it explains things. I can explain what's happening and it can tell me what to play. And most people spend time doing that because they think it's important, because it's relevant to what the rest of their life has been. But they put so much focus there that the artsy-fartsy side of music, which is just playing and seeing what happens, learning what the sounds are, learning how to express, that doesn't get touched on as much. And in the vast majority of cases, in my experience, my Western style students have a much easier time grasping music theory than actually playing the music and executing the music. So for most Western people, I think it's safe to assume that practicing more just playing is going to be more beneficial than learning music theory, if that makes sense. Because that music theory is kind of like an old friend for Western thinkers. It's very familiar. It's like math. It's like physics. It's like whatever you studied in school. It has these guidelines and this understanding that comes around with it. The part that people struggle with is actually playing the instrument and creating music and expressing and learning to use that other side of their brain. So if you're overthinking the theory, I encourage you, take a chill pill, play more music, just pick up the ukulele and create sounds with it, as opposed to freaking out about, exactly what you're playing, because exactly what you're playing doesn't matter if you're not just playing something to learn how it sounds, right? With music, it's kind of a volume thing, not literally the volume of the music, but just the amount of time and the amount of notes that you create, the amount of time you put into playing. That's where the familiarity of expression comes from, not from studying the music theory. But all that said, on the other side of the coin, there are folks who play pretty well, but they don't have any idea what they're doing. They don't understand why things are happening. And I could see it being easy to feel like you're being left behind and you're missing something. And in a way you are, but for the most part, I think that folks who have this approach where they're more comfortable playing than they are thinking about music, they're in a small minority. But then there's everybody in between. And so to kind of bring it all together again is I took the important items, or the majority of the important items from the list, and I put it together into this workshop lesson video that I released a couple months ago. You can go check it out if you want. It's called Street Theory, but really the goal with it was don't go overkill with the theory. Like, this is kind of what you need to know. You don't need to know more than this. It's just like an hour, 80 minutes actually, long crash course in just the basics of music theory, but from an ukulele standpoint, where it's not, reading a classically guided music theory book, which can be so dry and it can give you so much extra information that you don't use. Time is precious, and I think that ukulele players should be given the choice to learn music theory kind of on their own terms, not on the terms of Juilliard or the LA Philharmonic or whoever kind of expects this high level of classical knowledge and understanding of music. We're not all going to be Mozart. So with that in mind, there's just kind of like a baseline amount of stuff that you can learn. And so that's what I tried to present in this workshop. Link in the podcast information if you're so inclined and you're interested. Hopefully the list format today wasn't too tiring and you found that useful. I think the main takeaway that I want to share with this information is basically that practice is good. Theory helps explain some things, but practice is usually better, usually more important. Take that as you will. Take the whole list as you will. This is just me kind of rapping off the cuff and sharing some things that through my teaching I've observed and learned and feel like that's how my rankings came together, as what I have come to conclusions on, kind of, sort of. Couple reminders: the Live Ukulele podcast is published every first and third Saturdays of the month. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast service and tell your friends. Live Ukulele is also ad-free at this point in time, so your support is greatly appreciated, whether it be just spreading the news, telling people about the teaching that I do, or going to liveukulele.com/store and checking out some of the lessons that I have on offer there. Really appreciate the ability to do this for a living and to be able to spend my time thinking about teaching people how to play the ukulele better, how to make people better players, but also how to become a better teacher and help through. It's kind of like a chicken and the egg thing, right? The teacher and the player goes around in circles, and we all learn from each other. So I feel very grateful to be able to do this, and I love being able to take you folks along for the ride during podcasts like this. I'll catch you in the next episode. We've got a couple of interviews on the horizon as I'm putting this together. Brian Liu we've been having some email correspondence, want to get him on the podcast, and also the director of the Institute of Hawaiian Music, Keola Donaghy, who was kind of the point man that I worked with when I was going through the Institute of Hawaiian Music. Really interesting guy. He's fluent in Hawaiian, he writes Hawaiian songs, but then he also has kind of a lot of musical connections with Hara and different things like that, and is also the director of this Institute of Hawaiian Music program that I attended. So looking forward to catching up with him. Until then, keep on jamming out there and reach out if you have any thoughts or questions. Ahui ho, malama pono, and aloha.